You feel pain like no other pain, and you know that in your life it's going to be very difficult to...
The summit was supposed to reinforce the future of the monarchy. Instead, one unexpected face destroyed the meeting before it could even begin. Catherine noticed him first, an advisor who had never been invited, never been approved, and should not have been inside that part of the palace. William looked once, understood the danger immediately, and made a decision that stunned everyone waiting beyond the doors. The royal summit was cancelled. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Catherine stopped just inside the doorway and did not take another step. The summit, a closed meeting where senior royals and selected advisors discuss sensitive family and institutional decisions, had been arranged to deal with future responsibilities, household restructuring, and the next phase of the crown. Every seat had been assigned. Every name had been cleared. Yet Sir Adrian Vale was already sitting inside the restricted room, calm enough to suggest he believed he belonged there. Catherine turned toward William and lowered her voice. He was not supposed to be here. She did not sound confused. She sounded certain. William studied her face before he looked back at Vale. The prince had entered expecting difficult conversations about the monarchy's future, but now the gathering had changed. Catherine was not merely surprised, she was deeply unsettled, and he understood that difference immediately. He told the equerry beside him that nobody else was to enter, and nobody already inside was to leave. An equerry is a royal aide who assists members of the family with official duties and access. William then ordered the summit cancelled. No delay, no shortened agenda. Everyone waiting outside was told the meeting would not proceed. Charles received the message moments later and initially believed there had been a security emergency. The king asked whether someone had forced entry, but William's answer made the situation more disturbing. Vale had not arrived through the main security route assigned to summit guests. He had entered through an internal palace access point, which meant someone with recognized authority appeared to have enabled his passage. Charles fell silent. The monarch understood what that suggested. The problem may not have come from outside the palace. Catherine then gave William the detail that turned concern into something personal. She had seen Vale before in another place where he had no obvious reason to be. The memory had never fully left her, and now it returned with clarity. William had cancelled one summit to secure the room, but Catherine's next revelation would force him to question how long that room, and perhaps far more than that, had already been compromised. Catherine did not react, because an unfamiliar man had entered a royal meeting. She reacted because the man was familiar. Too familiar. Months earlier, she had noticed the same advisor hovering at the edge of conversations connected to William's household, appearing briefly, disappearing quietly, never staying long enough to invite confrontation. Now he was inside a closed summit. For Catherine, coincidence had just become a pattern, and William could see she believed the pattern pointed directly toward them. Catherine moved with William into a private side room and finally told him what she remembered. Sir Adrian Vale had once worked around royal charitable and constitutional discussions, but he no longer held any official position that should have given him automatic access to sensitive palace meetings. Constitutional discussions, in simple terms, are conversations about how the monarchy operates within Britain's system of government and public duty. That mattered because this summit was not ceremonial. William saw it as part of preparing for heavier responsibilities ahead, while Catherine saw it as a test of who could be trusted near their family and their future. William listened as she described the earlier encounter. Months before, Catherine had seen Vale standing outside a restricted briefing linked to the prince's household. She had questioned his presence at the time, but an aide assured her that he was there temporarily, and that everything had been cleared. She believed it had been handled. Now that reassurance felt dangerously hollow. William's anger rose quickly, but not toward her. He wanted to know why a concern raised by Catherine had apparently disappeared before it ever reached him. She answered quietly that she had trusted the people around them to deal with it. William immediately requested the official attendance sheet from the cancelled summit. Vale's name was nowhere on it. He was absent from the original list, absent from the late additions, and absent from every recognized delegation connected to the meeting. The prince checked again, then asked whether any verbal approval had been recorded. There was nothing. Catherine watched him move from frustration into something colder. A man had entered a restricted royal meeting without leaving a clear administrative trail. Catherine then remembered the details she had pushed aside months earlier. During that first encounter, Vale had not been alone. He had been speaking privately with a senior household intermediary connected to royal scheduling, the same network now involved in arranging this summit. William ordered that person identified at once, but before the answer reached him, Charles requested a private conversation with his son. The king had heard Vale's name. More troubling still, Charles seemed to recognize it before William had finished explaining what had happened. The mystery was no longer simply how an advisor entered the palace. It was why the monarch already knew exactly who William was talking about. The warning had come months before the cancelled summit, inside a much smaller room where only 4 people were meant to hear it. Catherine had questioned why an outside advisor seemed to know details of William's private planning before those details had formally circulated. The concern was dismissed as administrative overlap. No confrontation followed. No investigation began. But that forgotten conversation now returned with brutal clarity, because the man at its center had somehow crossed another locked threshold. Catherine remembered how easily Sir Adrian Vale had once blended into the edges of palace business. He had advised indirectly on institutional strategy, and kept relationships with senior courtiers long after his formal role ended, making him familiar enough that few people immediately challenged his presence. Palace households depend heavily on trusted intermediaries, officials who carry messages, coordinate access, and connect different royal offices. And that culture of discretion can become dangerous when familiarity starts replacing clear authority. Vale knew the system. More importantly, the system knew him. Catherine admitted to William that she had doubted herself after the first incident. She had wondered whether she was reading too much into one strange encounter, especially after people she trusted told her there was nothing unusual about it. The prince found that harder to accept than the original mistake. Her instinct had not simply been ignored. It had been softened by reassurance, until she stopped pressing the question. William told her that if something troubled her enough to speak, nobody around them had the right to make that concern disappear quietly. Catherine agreed, but the damage to her confidence was already clear. Charles reacted differently when his son challenged the older system. The king argued that informal channels had sometimes prevented larger disputes by allowing difficult conversations to happen away from formal structures. William pushed back immediately. An informal channel could be useful, he said, but once nobody knew who had approved a person's access, discretion had become concealment. Charles did not answer quickly. The monarch understood the difference, even if he disliked what it suggested about the household built around him. Catherine then returned to the moment that now looked like the true beginning of the crisis. 3 months earlier, during a private Windsor succession planning briefing, she had stepped out unexpectedly and found Vale speaking with the king's deputy private secretary, while holding a handwritten copy of the next meeting's restricted agenda. Succession planning means preparing for how duties and responsibilities pass through the royal line when leadership changes. When Catherine questioned the document, she was told Vale had received it for background only. A documented account of that exchange now showed the explanation exactly as she remembered it. William checked the records. No official note showed that restricted agenda had ever been sent to Vale. The prince then asked one question: who last authorized his palace access privileges? The answer pointed directly toward someone close enough to the summit to demand confrontation. What had looked like an old administrative irregularity had become the first link in a chain, and William was about to follow it straight into the room where Vale was waiting. William did not send security first. He went himself. Catherine entered beside him. Charles followed moments later, and the room fell silent before anybody spoke. Sir Adrian Vale remained seated for 1 second too long. Then William stopped opposite him and asked the simplest question in the palace. "Who invited you?" Vale's hesitation changed everything, because instead of naming a person, he said he believed his attendance had already been cleared. William kept his voice controlled, as the last unnecessary staff members were removed from the summit room. Only Catherine, Charles, Vale, and one security official remained with him. The summit itself was still cancelled, and that mattered, because William was no longer dealing with a scheduling problem. He was confronting a possible breach of authority between royal households. A royal household is the team of advisors, aides, and officials who support a senior member of the family. If someone could move between those households without clear permission, then trust inside the palace had become dangerously blurred. Vale tried to remain calm when William asked who had contacted him. He said the invitation had come through established palace channels, language vague enough to sound legitimate, without naming anyone. The prince placed the approved attendance list on the table and told him that no such channel had passed through his office. Catherine watched the advisor closely. She had already seen what happened when uncertainty was allowed to hide behind polite explanations, and this time she refused to let the moment slip away. Catherine asked Vale whether he remembered Windsor. He did. The answer came quickly, but his composure changed when she mentioned the restricted agenda he had been holding that day. He no longer dismissed the earlier encounter as harmless overlap. William noticed the shift immediately. Catherine pressed further, reminding him that the agenda had never been officially sent. Vale admitted, in a recorded account made during the confrontation, that he had received information through people who believed he should remain informed about sensitive planning. Charles stiffened when Vale explained why he believed he belonged at the summit. The advisors said senior figures wanted an independent voice present because the meeting would discuss changes affecting the king's household and William's future authority. Then he used a phrase that stopped the monarch cold: continuity above personalities. Charles recognized it from private strategic discussions inside his own household. The king knew instantly that Vale had been briefed by somebody close enough to hear language never meant to travel beyond those rooms. Vale resisted naming his contact for several tense moments. William did not raise his voice. He simply repeated the question. Finally, the advisor gave him a name, the palace intermediary who had directed him toward the summit, and assured him his presence would be accepted. William had expected to uncover an unauthorized guest. Instead, he had uncovered a hidden channel running straight through the machinery surrounding his father. A royal household can survive disagreement. What it cannot survive is uncertainty over who is actually giving the orders. William now faced exactly that danger. Val had not climbed a wall or forced his way through security. He had been treated like somebody expected. That meant the real problem was not the advisor sitting inside the room. It was the authority behind him, and whether that authority believed William's permission could simply be bypassed. Charles summoned Martin Ellison for a private conversation and asked one question first. Why had Vale been directed toward the summit without formal approval? Ellison served as a senior coordinating secretary inside the king's wider household, meaning he helped different royal offices communicate, arrange access, and manage sensitive meetings. He answered carefully. He believed the summit had become too narrow, too controlled by William's circle, and feared that major decisions about transition and reform would be made without enough resistance. Vale, he said, was meant to provide an independent strategic voice. Charles did not accept the explanation easily. The king still held sovereign authority and commanded his own household. while William increasingly controlled decisions involving his office, Catherine, their children, and preparations for the monarchy's future. That overlap had always required trust. Now Ellison was admitting that people serving the monarch had quietly tried to counterbalance the prince. Charles set his glasses down and told the secretary that protecting the crown could never mean deceiving the people expected to inherit its burden. Ellison insisted he had acted out of loyalty. The king answered that loyalty without permission could become something far more dangerous. William received the access trail soon afterward, and the details hardened his suspicions. Vale had never been formally added to the summit list. Instead, someone had issued him temporary internal clearance under a generic consultation category, a routine label used for approved visitors attending limited palace business. The process looked legitimate on paper, but its purpose had been hidden. The advisor had been processed through the system without being openly identified as a summit participant. Catherine's earlier concern then returned with even greater force. William learned through a documented internal account that her Windsor question about Vale had also been routed through Ellison's office before disappearing from further discussion. The same administrative channel now connected both incidents. Catherine had raised the alarm months earlier, and the concern had gone nowhere. William could no longer treat the summit breach as one bad judgment. Charles now faced the decision everyone around him understood, but nobody wanted to name. He could defend a long-serving secretary who believed he was protecting institutional continuity, or he could support William's demand for an immediate reset of palace access. For the first time that day, the crisis was no longer about one uninvited advisor. It had become a test of whether Charles would protect the old system or allow his son to dismantle part of it. Canceling the summit was easy, compared with what came afterward. Invitations had to be withdrawn. Cars were redirected. Senior aides were told nothing beyond the phrase, "internal scheduling issue." Behind closed doors, however, nobody believed this was a scheduling problem. Catherine felt exposed. William felt undermined. Charles felt the machinery around him slipping into competing loyalties. And somewhere between those reactions, the monarchy confronted a truth it could no longer disguise. Trust had become its most fragile security system. William moved quickly once the decision was made. Summit attendees were discreetly told the meeting would be rescheduled, while access privileges connected to the cancelled gathering were placed under immediate review. Sir Adrian Vale was escorted from the private wing without confrontation, and no public accusation followed him out. The prince then ordered a temporary freeze on informal guest clearances involving his household or any joint meeting attended by Catherine. A guest clearance is simply the approval that allows someone into a restricted royal area, and William now wanted every approval tied to a named person and a clear purpose. Familiarity would no longer be enough. Catherine finally allowed the strain to show once she and William were alone in a smaller room. She told him that Vale himself was not what frightened her most. What hurt was knowing she had noticed something months earlier, spoken about it, and then allowed herself to believe the reassurance that followed. William sat beside her without interrupting. The prince understood that this was no longer only about palace procedure. Catherine had trusted the people around them to treat her concerns seriously, and that trust had failed before the summit ever began. William told her that canceling the meeting would make people angry. It might even be used against him as proof that he acted too quickly. But continuing after Catherine raised the alarm would have sent a worse message, that keeping the schedule mattered more than believing her. She looked at him differently after that. The anger remained, but it was no longer mixed with doubt. Charles made his own decision soon afterward. The king removed Martin Ellison from summit-related duties, pending an internal review, a formal examination of how decisions were made and whether rules had been bypassed. He did not excuse the method, even if he understood the fear behind it. Before leaving the process, Ellison told Charles in a recorded internal conversation that Vale had been brought in because some within the older household feared William would accelerate reform once greater authority passed to him. That confession changed the shape of the crisis. This had not been sabotage, it had been fear. Fear of what William might change, fear of what Charles might lose, and fear of a monarchy moving faster than some people could accept. William's anger cooled into something heavier. The palace had spent hours tracing who opened the door. Now he needed to ask his father why anyone had been afraid enough to open it in the first place. When William entered Charles's private sitting room that evening, there were no folders, no secretaries, and no prepared statements waiting between them. That absence mattered. For years, royal disagreements had been softened by layers of protocol. This one could not be. Charles knew his son believed his authority had been bypassed. William knew his father feared losing control of an institution he had spent a lifetime preparing to lead. For once, neither man had anyone else to blame. William spoke first, and made one point clear. Canceling the summit had not been an attempt to challenge Charles or embarrass the king's household. The prince had stopped it because he could not continue a sensitive meeting once he no longer trusted who had been allowed into the room. Protocol, in plain terms, is the set of formal rules and customs that guide royal conduct and decision-making. Those rules were supposed to create order. Instead, hidden exceptions had created confusion at the worst possible moment. Charles listened without interruption before admitting something he had resisted all day. The king understood why long-serving officials feared sudden change under the next generation. Some had spent decades protecting routines they believed kept the monarchy stable, and they worried William would move faster than they could accept. But Charles also acknowledged that those fears had now produced exactly the instability they were meant to prevent. Unofficial channels had not protected unity. They had widened the divide between father and son. William's voice changed when he brought Catherine into the conversation. Vale's appearance had angered him, but the deeper wound was knowing her concern at Windsor had been quietly dismissed months earlier. The prince told his father that she had trusted the household to take her seriously. Charles showed immediate regret. He said Catherine's warning should have reached both of them, and he accepted that the failure had left her doubting instincts that had ultimately proved correct. Charles then gave William the clearest answer of the entire crisis. In a documented account of their private conversation, the king stated that he had never authorized Vale's attendance and knew nothing about the temporary clearance issued in his name. The admission removed one suspicion, but created another responsibility. Charles had not ordered the breach, yet people inside his own structure had believed they were entitled to act without him. William and his father finally moved from blame toward repair. Charles agreed that the rescheduled summit would operate under one jointly approved guest list, with no informal observers and no parallel briefings. William, in return, agreed that cautioning voices would remain part of the discussion. Reform would not become an excuse to silence disagreement. Charles made one final request before his son left. He wanted Catherine included from the beginning of the next discussion, not simply because she had spotted Vale, but because her judgment had changed how the entire summit would now operate. The meeting that collapsed in distrust had created the rules for its replacement, and by morning, the outside world was beginning to realize that something extraordinary had happened behind palace doors. The palace tried to contain the cancellation with one sterile sentence. It lasted less than an hour. By breakfast, broadcasters were discussing a mysterious security disruption. Newspapers were asking why senior vehicles had left Buckingham Palace without the expected meeting, and crowds outside the gates were photographing every arrival. Yet the public did not know the most important detail. Catherine had recognized the problem before anyone else, and William had ended the summit rather than ask her to ignore it. William read the official statement, and immediately knew it would not end the questions. The palace confirmed only that the royal summit had been postponed, following an internal access irregularity, refusing to identify Sir Adrian Vale or discuss individual security procedures while the review continued. An internal access irregularity simply means someone entered a restricted royal setting without the expected approval being clearly recorded. That language protected sensitive details, but it also left space for speculation. Some saw the prince's decision as decisive leadership. Others asked how an unapproved advisor had reached such a sensitive meeting at all. Catherine disliked becoming the emotional center of the story, even before her role was widely understood. She had never wanted recognition for noticing Vale. She had wanted the concern taken seriously. Charles understood that distinction. In a private conversation recorded for the Household Review, the king told her that recognizing something was wrong had protected everyone who entered that room. Catherine answered that she only wished the earlier warning at Windsor had carried the same weight. The monarch did not argue. He knew that regret was now part of the lesson. William reacted more sharply when commentators began framing the cancellation as a confrontation between father and son. The prince believed that version missed the point completely. Charles agreed, and authorized palace officials to emphasize that the rescheduled summit had the full support of both royal households. The king wanted one message understood. Whatever disagreements existed over reform, neither he nor William would defend hidden access or unofficial influence. Public attention exploded when the fictional morning edition of the Chronicle appeared beneath the headline, "The Empty Summit. William cancels palace meeting after mystery advisor breach." Outside Buckingham Palace, visitors held copies against the railings while television correspondents repeated the same question. How had Vale entered? The image turned an internal dispute into a national symbol of royal vulnerability. Charles answered that pressure with action. The palace announced that every attendee at future joint royal meetings would require approval from both the hosting household and the principal royals involved. William supported the change immediately, and Catherine understood what it meant. The loophole that had silenced her first warning had finally been closed. The scandal had begun with a stranger in the wrong chair. Its final meaning would be decided when William and Catherine returned to that same room and discovered whether trust could truly be rebuilt there. Days later, William returned to the room where he had stopped everything. Catherine walked beside him. Charles was already inside. This time, every chair had a name, every advisor had been approved, and nobody had entered through an unofficial channel. The difference was larger than security procedure. The monarchy had been forced to choose between inherited habits and visible accountability, and the people at the center of the crisis had decided that trust could not survive unless authority became clear. Catherine paused before taking her place. The chair once occupied by Sir Adrian Vale carried no mystery now, because the rescheduled summit was operating under new joint access rules. Those rules simply meant that every attendee had to be approved by both the hosting household and the principal royals involved. Vale was absent. Martin Ellison no longer controlled summit coordination. William and Charles had personally approved the final attendance, removing the gray areas that had allowed one quiet decision to shake an entire institution. William noticed Catherine's hesitation and asked whether she was comfortable continuing. She answered yes. That single word mattered, because she was no longer entering a room where her instincts had been dismissed. She was reclaiming it. The prince understood that the summit could not succeed if she felt pressured to ignore what she had seen, while Catherine knew that walking away forever would allow the breach to define the space more than the people who had corrected it. Charles addressed the group before the agenda began. The king acknowledged Catherine's intervention and said that speaking when something felt wrong had prevented a far deeper collapse of confidence. William did not turn the moment into a speech. He simply reached for her hand beneath the edge of the table. The agenda still carried difficult questions about future responsibilities, institutional reform, household cooperation, and continuity. But disagreement was no longer being hidden behind unofficial influence. The internal review delivered the final answer. A documented account concluded that Vale had entered through a genuine temporary clearance system that Ellison had improperly used without the knowledge of William, Catherine, or Charles. There had been no secret order from the monarch. Instead, anxious courtiers had tried to influence the summit's balance because they feared the speed of future reform. The mystery ended there. The greater failure had been a culture that allowed informal authority to become stronger than transparent responsibility. Charles accepted his part in allowing that culture to grow. William accepted something too. Reform could not mean surrounding himself only with people who agreed with him. Dissenting voices would remain, but they would speak openly. No concealed access. No back-channel maneuvers. No quiet exceptions. The cancelled summit became a defining moment, because Catherine trusted what she saw. William trusted her enough to act, and Charles ultimately chose reform over defensiveness. The monarchy emerged bruised, but clearer. Loyalty would no longer mean silence. Tradition would no longer excuse ambiguity. Access to royal power would require accountability. There was no mystery left to solve. One uninvited advisor exposed a weakness inside the palace, and the family's response turned that weakness into a boundary they would never again allow anyone to cross. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.